We'll go ahead and get started here. I want to thank you guys for attending our webinar today. Today's webinar is going to be another webinar in our Sage Intacct webinar series, and this one today is going to be covering approval processes. So we'll kind of talk about that here a little further. Some quick introductions here on the call. So my name is Joe Gupser. I am the partner of the Sage Software Division here at Martin and Associates, and there's my contact information there in terms of my phone number and my email address. Also on the call here as well is Brett Penzinger. He's the director of our Sage Software Division here at Martin and Associates, and then there is his contact information as well. Brett will be chiming in, answering questions and whatnot as we go through here today, so you'll hear him kind of jump in as well. Potentially, at least at the end of nothing else. So just wanted to get our introductions out of the way there. Here's a quick agenda for what we're going to cover today. We'll do a quick introduction of Martin and Associates, a quick introduction to the Sage Intacct product in general. Though all this PowerPoint stuff is going to be pretty quick. We're going to talk about transaction approvals that are available. We'll talk about approval rule types that are available. Value rule examples. We'll kind of go through some screenshot examples of how the approvals will flow through. We'll talk about delegate approvers, and we'll talk about unrestricted approvers as well. A little quick background about Martin & Associates. So Martin & Associates was founded in 1988. We currently have 26 employees that are based in our Cincinnati office location area, as well as a couple satellite employees scattered across the United States as well. Our employees have a varied background. We have some CPA/accountant backgrounds, business process analysts, people who are more technical and programming side, hardware, server expertise. So we have a wide range of expertise across our 26 full-time employees here. We specialize in the ERP accounting marketplace, CRM, and the add-on supplementary solutions that go along with that. We kind of focus on Sage Intacct, Sage 100, Acumatica, Microsoft, and the Creatio CRM product. And we do the approach of your project team stays the same. What that basically means is, let's say you kind of engage with us about, let's talk about Sage Intacct a little further, and you're dealing with Brett and I of, kind of analyzing the product, and does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Run a test through, and you guys decide to move forward with Sage Intacct. It's not like that Brett and I then just immediately hand you off to somebody else. We're still involved in the process. We get other people involved at the same time, but there's some continuity between the sales process through the implementation, through the training, through the go live to help with all that. Quickly about Sage Intacct here. So Sage Intacct is a quote unquote born in the cloud solution. Intacct was founded in 1999. It has been a native cloud product from the first line of code on. It's very reliable. It's got a 99.8% uptime commitment that they have, and they do automatic backups, all that stuff for you automatically. So with Intacct, you don't need a server to run your ERP system. You just, it's running in the web, and you access it through a web browser. So as it mentions there, you can access your Intacct from anywhere, anytime, as long as you have a web browser and you have an internet connection, you're able to access your Sage Intacct. Their dashboards built in. There's multi-entity, multi-bin, multi-currency all built in. The approval process is available throughout the system. That's kind of this bullet right there is the one we're going to kind of be concentrating on today right here. There's automatic updates that happen through the system throughout the year. 4 new releases per year get released, and they happen automatically. So there's no downtime for you in terms of, hey, we got to schedule your upgrade, move things forward, all that kind of stuff. It just happens. You'll get the note that on this day, the upgrade is going to happen from Sage, and it happens overnight. You come in next day, you're on a new version. It's a best of breed product, which means easy integration to other solutions. It was designed for professional finance people, CFOs along that line. For a powerful solution to get them the accounting information that they need. And the last bullet there was chosen as the first and only preferred financial management software by the AICPA. Here's a quick timeline about Sage Intacct. So as I mentioned, it was founded in '99 and it went through all the process, all its growth here. Got the AICPA endorsement here in 2009. In 2017, that is when Sage Software purchased Sage Intacct. And really from 2017 through now, 2024, is when the product's really kind of taken accelerated growth with a lot of new features, a lot of new functionality. Sage has done a really good job of kind of building out the product that Sage Intacct, the initial product, started out as. And it always ranks really high in customer satisfaction surveys year after year in terms of user interface and user interaction. Let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. So as I mentioned, we're talking about transaction approvals, and built in natively to Sage Intacct, there are transaction approval processes available for GL journal entries, vendors, AP bills/invoices, AP payments, purchasing transactions, which would include requisitions, purchase orders, on down the line, expense reports, expense report reimbursements, and timesheets. So that doesn't mean you have to have approvals for each of those. It just means you can turn approvals on for each of those. There are different, with these transactions, you can set up the transaction approval process however you kind of want, what works for your company, and it can be different across each of the different transaction types. But it offers the following approval types, and we'll kind of see more data or more details about each of these as we kind of progress through the webinar here. But there's a value-based approval available, manager-based, user-based, transaction type specific approvals, and an alternate approver functionality as well. There's a robust, it's robust, it's flexible in terms of how you can manage the approvals within inside of Intacct, and you determine how you want them to work. So these bullets point that out here. You determine, as I mentioned before, which transactions you want to turn approval processes on for. You determine who is going to be included in the approval process. What is the sequence of approval? How does it route through your company? And then any other factors that are needed to determine the appropriate approver, like the amount, the department, etc., of how it's going to route. So here's the approval rule types available. There is what is called a named user, which means if you have a transaction set up and the approval type for that transaction is set to a named user, then that means you're telling it who the specific user is inside the system that's going to approve those transactions, and it will automatically route to that user. There's also the employee manager. So whatever employee is tied to the transaction, it'll look at that employee's manager and it will route the request to that employee's manager. So here's an example right here. So here's an employee record. Let's say that Tom Waits is putting a transaction in, okay? So it goes out and looks at his employee information and says, who is Tom Waits' manager? And it says, okay, it's Michael Bolton. So number 2 here, it would automatically route any transactions that Tom Waits put in to Michael Bolton if the transaction that he is entering has the approval rule set up to be employee manager. Department works similar, but it goes off of the department that the employee that is entering the transaction. So here's the employee record again. It looks at their department. So number 3 here, it then says, okay, that's the 320 finance department. It goes out and looks at that department out in department maintenance and says, who is the manager of that department? And it's Emma Penny. So any transaction that got entered by Tom Waits for a transaction that's set to be department approval, department manager approval, it'll go out to Emma Penny in that example. Transaction location approval. So here's an example of a transaction here. So this is a PO we're putting in and we're telling it, here's the location, here's the department, and here's the project it's tied to if you have project tracking turned on. But the transaction level approval will look, if you have a transaction set with this rule type, it'll look at the location of a transaction and it'll route to the manager of that location. And you can only have one location selected per document because it's got to know who to route to if you go that approval type. If you go the rule type of transaction department, then it looks at the department assigned to the transaction, and it'll route to the department manager, but it'll be based on the department that's on the transaction. And again, you can only have one department selected per transaction you're trying to get approved as well, because it has to know who to route to if you go with this type. And then there's the project manager, same concept. It goes and looks at the project, sees what manager is assigned to it, and routes accordingly. And you can only have one project selected per document, so it knows how to route. There are also value-based approvals. So if you just do a value approval, then the approval routing is based on the dollar amount of the transaction, and the rule determines the level of approval and approval amounts for each level. And then users are assigned approval levels that they are at, and then the transaction will route accordingly directly to the level in which the amount falls. And then somebody in that level has to approve it. And it could be more than one. You can tell it the minimum number of approvers needed at a level. So if it requires, say there's 5 people at a particular level and 2 of those 5 have to approve before it moves on, it'll wait until at least 2 of those 5 approve before the transaction moves on. Then the next one is value approval progressive. This is the last one here. This is based on the amount of the transaction, and it determines the level of approvals and approval amounts like we talked about above. But this routing starts at the first level, regardless of what level that approver is at, and it keeps progressing through the approval chain until it gets to a level that has the ability to approve the total amount of the transaction, and then the transaction gets approved. Okay, so let's look at some quick examples here visually on the screen. Here's an example of a value approver. We're doing a purchase order. So this purchase order is for $4,200, and we have 3 levels set up. Level 1 can approve from $5,000 to $9,000 or $9,999, all the way up to level 3 can approve over $100K. Well, this PO is only for $4,200. That's below the amount of that level 1 needs to approve. So this transaction automatically gets approved and moves on to the next stage, which is to be able to create a purchase order or an invoice or anything off of it. Here's an example of a value approver, example number 2. This is a PO where it's a value approval. So this one is $12,000. So it skips level 1 in this case because they only can approve up to $9,999. So this jumps right to level 2 because that's the level of where this transaction falls. And then it waits for level 2 approvers, 1 or more, depending on how you set it up, to approve it. And then it moves to the next phase. Any rejections on any of these will stop the approval flow and send it back to the initial approver, and they have to make whatever changes they're told to make because of the rejection, and then it routes again and goes through the approval process again. The person who is the requester is notified via email if that part's set up, and we're going to see all that. Here's a value approver. This is a progressive one. Okay, so here's a $12,250 PO, and this one's progressive. So it starts at level 1. Level 1, once they approve, they can only approve up to $9,999. So that's not enough to approve this transaction. So it then jumps to the next level, and it routes to the approvers at that level and says, okay, you have to approve this transaction. Once they approved it, it would end the approval process because they can approve up to that amount, and it moves to the next steps. And just like before, any rejection stops the flow, and the requester is notified via email if that's enabled. So there's value department approval as well. This goes off of the department of the employee submitted the transaction. So here's an example. Here's a value rule set up, okay? Here is the employee setup. Martin Luther is going to be entering in this transaction, and they're in department 200. Here is the approval tree for 200 right here, where if it's greater than or equal to 10,000, it goes to Emma. Greater than or equal to 100,000, it goes to Tom. Here's an example of a transaction we're going to see here. If it's a $20,000 transaction, it comes here and says 200 department, greater than 10,000, but less than 100,000, it goes to Emma, so it went to her. If the transaction was 105, it would skip Emma and go right to Tom here because of the way we set this approver up, or this approval rule up. And here's a value approval based on the transaction department. So another example. So here is departmental approval, similar to what we looked at before. This is going off of the department on the or off the transaction though, not the department on the employee. So here's lines on a purchase order or a PO requisition. See how they're all going to department 300. So it's going to come out here and look at this line here and use this tree. So if I look now, a $3,000 or your 3,000 would be approved special. So it goes to this special approver right here. And if it's 105, it would go to Tom. So again, it just goes off the department on the transaction, not the department on the employee. Couple more slides here, and we're going to actually jump in and start looking at some of this. There is also the ability to do delegate approvers as well. And a delegate approver is an individual who can approve transactions for an individual when they're not available to approve. The delegate must have the appropriate transaction approval permissions. Only users that have those permissions will appear on the list of delegates to be assigned. The delegate only impacts new transactions. So if a transaction is already in process, it will not route to that delegate. Only ones that happen when the delegate's set up. The delegate will approve. The delegate approval only applies to specific workflows. Okay, so it doesn't work for these, and it currently is only available for GL journal entries and purchasing transactions. Here's an example in the configure purchasing setup where you can say manage delegation, and then you tell it what delegates right here underneath the manage button. So for each user, you can set up a default delegate that will be available for that user if we turn on the delegate part. There's also an unrestricted approver as well. So an unrestricted approver means that if their approval rejection ends any approval routing regardless. Okay, so there might be a tree that's going through, but if you have somebody that's set up as being the unrestricted approver, they get it as well. If they approve it, then it basically ends that approval, or if they reject it, it ends that approval process. Okay, because they're like the master approver, basically, we're saying. So this comes in handy if you have a number of approvers that are out of the office or whatever, and you don't want it to be stuck out there in an approval loop. You have an unrestricted user that can go out and approve it. And this is the unrestricted user here. Here's an example when you configure your purchasing as well. Here's my unrestricted approver. This one's set up to Emma. And that's available only right now currently for purchasing transactions, AP bills, and expense reports. Okay. So that is the quick PowerPoint slide. Let's jump in here now and let's look at Sage Intacct. So I'm logged in, Sage Intacct. I'm logged on as a user here called Joe Gupser. And let's put in an AP bill here first and look at how this process works, or talk about the AP process first. So I'm going to come into accounts payable. I'm going to go into setup, and I'm going to go into configuration. So I'm looking at the setup of my AP module. Okay, so if I scroll down to where the approval processes all get set up here. Okay, so I can set up approvals for bills. So enable bill approval. So invoices like we talked about. I can set it up for vendors, which means if a new vendor gets put in the system, I can route that for approval as well before it actually creates the vendor. Or I can set it up for AP payments. For this system, we only have it set up for bills, not for vendors and for payments. So I turn it on. And then if you check this box to say email notifications, what that'll do is that will then email out when an approval is needed by a user or by an approver. They will get an email if this checkbox is checked, and if underneath the preferences of that user, they have it set to receive emails. So I duplicated my tab here. I'm going to go out underneath of Joe Gupser, my preferences, and there is going to be a request for approvals right here. And I could tell it by each of the approval types. Do I want to get emails for each of these? So for purchasing, for bills, journal entries, payment requests. So that those two hand in hand are what drive whether emails go to those particular users. All right. We talked about the unrestricted user. So on this one, the Brett Penzinger user is the unrestricted user. So he's the one that can basically trump everything. If you have it set up where you could have it set up out here, they can basically go and approve anything if you set it up. Doesn't have to be set up, but if you do, that's how it works. All right. So let's look at how do you set up the approval process now, the tree or the flow of how it's going to go through. I'm going to click on this manage button here. And for my rule type for AP bills, I set this to go to what was called value approval transaction department. So I want it to go by the value of the transaction progressively through it, and it's going to be based on the department assigned to the AP bill. You then create these rule sets. So I'm going to go out here and view this one. So I created one called AP bills value. And when you set this up, you have a default approval tree for any department that you don't have department specialized or department specific routings for. So for specific department routings where I don't have them defined down here, we'll talk about in a little bit. It'll first go to bill approver, and he can approve from $0 up to $500, and then it will route to Joe controller for anything $501 and above. Okay. I can also set up specific routings by department. So here's one I set up for department 100. I called the approval tree sales department approval tree. And you'll notice on this one, it routes first for $0 up to $1,000. It goes to John approver. So you'll see that's different than the one up here where this went to bill approver. And then it goes to Joe controller for $1,000.01 and above. So you see how I have different rules for department 100 than I have for all the rest of them that don't have specific ones set up. And I could come in here and add another one. I could add, and I could do something specific for department 200, department 300 on down the line. Okay. So that gets me through all of that. The way you set up, let me go ahead and cancel out of this, close out of that. Well, I'm going to go back in here. If I'm in here and I come here, and let me just show you a different one here. If I pick like value approval, it goes to this add right here, and this is where I can manage my level 1s, level 2s, all that kind of stuff through here as well. Okay, so you can do different ways of doing it depending on the rule that you pick here, but I'm going to trash that one and not keep it. If you have approvals where it's level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and whatnot, the way you get to that and the way you assign all that is that's determined by roles. Roles are the security of what you can determine who can and can't get into certain things. So let me look at this AP manager role here for a minute and view their subscriptions, which is basically their permissions. So you notice for AP bill approvals, they're set to level 1, level 2, level 3. So this role has the ability of approving levels 1, 2, and 3, not 4, 5, and 6 for bills. Here's the ones for approved payments. And you'll notice they could have different levels based on the transaction we're talking about. You then assign these roles to users. So I'm going to go out here and look at bill approver. And bill approver is set to have the admin role, the AP manager role, and the employee users approvals. So it marries all three of those together, and that determines their appropriate levels that they can approve if you go level based by level 1, level 2, level 3 on down the line. Okay. Let me get back into here. So that's setting it up. We have it set up right now. So let's do this. I'm going to leave this up for a minute because we're going to look at this. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to look at the setup of this for default department and for department 100. I'm going to leave that up because I want to now put in a couple transactions and show you how this works. So I'm going to go to accounts payable. I'm going to go to bills. All right. I'm going to come out here and I am going to add a bill. So I'm going to go out here and add a bill. I'm going to just pick a vendor out here, ABC Supply Company. Okay, today's date's fine. I'm going to go down to my entries here. And for office supplies, let's just say that this is $750. And the reason this defaulted to office supplies is because the vendor ABC Supply Company has a default GL account set up for them for office supplies. That's why that defaulted, just an FYI there. I'm going to assign it to the location of 100 USA 1. I'm going to pick department 200 operations. I'm going to pick a channel for residential. All right. And I'm going to submit this. Okay. Notice this top transaction now is the one I just entered in. And look at the state of it. What does it say? It says it's been submitted. It hasn't been posted yet. It's been submitted to the approval process. If I go back into the transaction and go to the history tab, I can go down to the AP bill approval history and it will show me the approval steps it has to go through. So approval level 1, and it goes to bill approver. That's where it's at right now. It has been submitted to him. So it's waiting for bill approver to approve. The next one in the list will be Joe, controller, but he hasn't got it yet because it's still pending approval from the level above. Okay? So just want to show you how it's routing, and the way it got that routing of bill approver and Joe controller is because back here, we picked department 200, which wasn't down here in the department specific rules. So it used this approval tree and it started with bill approver, but he can only go up to $500 and this transaction was $750. So that's why once bill approver approves it, Joe controller has to approve it after him. Okay. Now, what happened is bill approver would have gotten an email. And this is the email he would have gotten right here. Something like this. Bill approver, the following accounts payable bill requires your approval. And it shows who submitted it, the date, the vendor, and the amount. They could click right here to go to their list of transactions. Okay. I'm logged in as bill approver because I was already logged in as them on another screen. And notice right here, I'm in my approved bills because I clicked on that hyperlink right from the email. So it took me right to that screen. And right here is the amount. Here's the bill that's out there waiting for me to approve it. Okay. So I'm going to come in here. I can look at this. I can view it. I can go in and look at the transaction. Notice I can't change anything because I'm just in the approval process here. I can approve it. I can decline it. Whether I approve it or decline it, I can put notes of why I'm approving it or why I'm declining it. Okay. And then it'll route back to the original person. If I decline it, it'll route to the next person if it gets if it's approved. There's also this tool down here, and this isn't anything specific to the approval process. This is just out in the system in general. But there's this collaborate tool out there, which is almost like a chat. It's a chat you can have assigned to transactions out there, and you can, make comments on here. So if I'm bill approver and I want to say this transaction looks good, thanks for entering, and I can say share, and that'll put that on this transaction. That's not doing anything yet. That's just making a note on this transaction right here. Okay, let's say I want to approve this. I'm going to approve it, and I'm going to say, looks good, and I say approve. You'll notice it drops off of bill approver up here in the top right. You'll see I'm logged on as bill approver. It dropped off his approval tree now. Okay, so I'm going to get out of him. It would have routed to the next user, which is Joe Controller. Let me get rid of that email. Here's the email that just came in for Joe Controller. So, hey, Joe Gupser, Controller. Same kind of email we just saw. We have the requester's bill approver because he approved it. It's now coming to me. I could do the same thing where I click the log in as Joe Controller, and it's going to go right in because I'm already logged in as that user on another screen. But notice how I'm now logged in as the Joe Controller user. Similar like what we saw with bill approver, I see the transactions out here, and I could approve it right from here. But I want to show you something different of what you can do as well. You don't have to go through the email, and you don't have to click on this screen. There are dashboards out in the system as well, okay? And if I go out here, and let's say I'm on a dashboard, and I'm going to go to this role-based dashboard called Controller. Okay, and look over here on the right-hand side. You can control what these dashboards look like. These are widgets you can put on, but I'm going to put one out here. I have one out here called Approved Bills. And notice I see an approval out here waiting for me. I have approved journal entries, approved purchasing transactions, approved expense reports, timesheets. So you can add these to dashboards. So that way if it pops up, oh, I got an approval out, a transaction out there waiting for me to approve. This user can click on their magnifying glass here, and it launches that screen for them. Same screen I was in before. But I just wanted to show you how you could get to that from dashboards as well. You can also, in addition to getting to it from dashboards, you can get to it through the menus by going to the module and going to approve bills, and it takes me to the same screen. Okay, so I wanted to point that out. But I'm going to go ahead and I know this one looks good. I already looked at it, so I'm going to approve it from here without going into the detail. And I'm going to say thanks. Okay. Before I submit this one though, let me show you something. I'm back out as the Joe Gupser one, the one who submitted this, the first user I started from. Let me go back. Notice how right now this was showing a status of submitted before. Notice it's now showing a status of partially approved. That's what happened when bill approver approved it. Okay, so now what happens? I'm going to approve it now by Joe Controller, which is the end of my approval tree. I'm going to approve it. Okay, go back to my Joe Gupser user now, the one who submitted it. Now watch and I refresh this screen. It will go from partially approved to, oops, got to it this way. It's going to now say posted. So that transaction now posted out there. Okay.
And Joe, real quick on the posted status, because I think a lot of, if not everyone on the call is from sort of the Sage 100 realm, where when they enter a transaction, that transaction has to go through a journal process and an update process. Posted in this sense means that it is in history. This is a posted transaction. When there is a draft status that you could do if you just want to work on a transaction, but when you either post a transaction or it goes through an approval process, that then does affect history right there. There's not a separate journal/update process that it has to go through.
Yeah, not batch entry, as Brett's mentioning there, for the people that are used to running the appropriate register and updating. Yep. All right. Thanks, Brett. So now let me go into this transaction. It's now been posted. All that history is still right here. If I go in and view this transaction, I can go to my posting detail here. I can go to my history, and I see that here's my AP bill approval history. So it's value-based or value approval transaction department. Bill approver approved it. It gives you the date. tells you what the state is, and any comments they put. So I said, looks good. There it is. Here it is here. Joe Controller approved it and said thanks. So I see all my history right there, right in the transaction. Okay. What you also have is, and I didn't show this, but when you're putting in I'll show it now because I want to put another one in here real quick. We're not going to go through the entire routing process, but I want to show you another one, and I'll point it out when I get to this other one. So I'm done with this one. Let me go out here and add another bill. I'll do the same vendor, ABC Supply here. And on this one, I'm going to come down. It's defaulting to office supplies again. This time I'm going to put in a little bit higher one. I want to put in $1,100. I'll pick the USA location again. However, this time I'm going to pick the sales department, where last time I picked department 200. This time I'm picking department 100. And we're going to see what that means here. If I go back to my rule set, remember I had department-specific routings for department 100. It will go different than this one that the last one did. Because on this one, for department 100, it goes first to John Approver up to $1,000. Then it goes to Joe Controller up to $1,000.01. Okay? So let's watch this one. I'm going to go ahead and submit this one. Okay, you notice it's submitted again. But let me go in and view this one. We're going to see a little bit different down here on the history. Notice on this one, see how it went to John Approver first, not Bill Approver? And then it's going to go to Joe Controller. That is because of the Department 100 specific routing right here. So just wanted to show you how you could have different routings based on the department assigned to the transaction. That's why it routed differently on this one because of the way I set that routing up. Okay, not going to go through the whole approval process on that again because the process works the same way, but just wanted to show you how that kind of goes through. I do want to show you this. When the first bill we put in got approved by Bill Approver, then Joe Controller got an email saying, hey, you have a bill out here ready to be just waiting for you to approve it. Once Joe Controller approved it, my user, Joe Gupser, got an email telling me, hey, the bill you submitted has been approved. So you get a notification as well letting you know once it got approved and it comes to you to tell you that it's been approved. Okay? Wanted to point that one out. All right, let's see. That's through the AP bill approval process. Let's look at another transaction where we could put an approval. We'll talk about this briefly in a different type. So for people that are on Sage 100, this is new to you because it goes right to putting in a purchase order in Sage 100. But in Intacct, there is the ability of putting in a purchase requisition. And that is an internal, somebody basically says, we need to order this stuff, but it's not a PO right away because we don't want to cut it to our vendor. We want it to go through the approval process internally before it gets approved to then get turned into a purchase order to then get submitted to your vendor. Okay, so there's a step prior to that. And we have a number of clients that have added on a product called eRequester to handle this functionality. We have clients that have added on the eRequester product to handle the AP bill functionality we just talked about on the last transactions. But what you do here is you put in a requisition and it can then route through the approval process if you set it up that way. So let's look at purchasing here. I'm going to go out to purchasing. I'm going to go to setup and I'm going to go to configuration, just like we did on AP a little bit ago. We're going to look at the setup of the approval for purchasing. So I'm going to scroll down and on on purchasing, here's the approvals. So I turn on enable purchasing approval. Okay. I can go out here and turn on, do I do it for vendors as well? What's happening with the thing, with the amounts, what's going on? Do I want emails to go? Remember on AP, we didn't have the ability to do delegates, but on PO, we can do delegates. So I turned on enable delegation here, and this is where you manage your delegates. So you have a default delegate up top, and that will default to the delegate that's going to, approve for people here if they can't approve. It'll default to that user up here, but you can change it on a approver by approver basis of who their delegate is. Okay. That's what this comes into play for. It'll also use it for anybody where the delegate's blank. It'll use the default delegate up here as well. So that's how you turn on delegates and start working with them. Here's the unrestricted user again, like we talked about on the AP side. But let's go in, and just like we did on the AP bill side, let's look at the approval policies. PO works a little differently because you can set it up for any of the transaction definitions that you define. So blanket PO, PO requisition, purchase order. So here's the PO requisition, which is the transaction that happens before a PO. I'm going to go out here and edit this. Okay. We have it set for department approval here, which means it's going to use whatever the department assigned to the person putting it in. It will use the manager of that department of who to route it to. Okay, so we have this right here. It's set up to department approval. Okay, let me go and look at my user real quick. So I'm going to jump out here and look at my user. Oh, wrong one. Let me go. I'm an external user here, so give me a minute. Let me look at my user, Joe Gupser right here. I'm going to edit my user, and this is my user. It's tied to an employee, so I'm going to then go into my employee record that's tied to me. And here is the Joe Gupser one. See how it's tied to my external Joe Gupser user we just looked at? If I edit this, see how I'm in department 100. That is my department assigned to me. So based on the way I have this PO rec to be department approval, I'm putting it in. It looks at my department, department 100. It then will go out to department 100. And says, okay, here's department 100. It goes out and looks at that and says, who is the manager of department 100? And that is right here. It's the Joe Gupser. I know these names are a little bit confusing here, but this isn't actually my Joe Gupser user. This is actually that Joe controller user is the manager here. Okay. Just wanted to point out how that approval all goes through. So it's department approval. It looks at the user here to see what department they're in and routes to the manager of that department for approval. All right. So let's put one in here. So I'm going to go out here and I'm going to go to purchasing. I'm going to go to all. I'm going to go to a quote and I'm going to put in a purchase requisition. I'm going to add a requisition. I'm going to use our favorite ABC supply vendor here. I'm going to, all the fields of default based on that. I'm going to come down here and say this is for rent, let's say. Rent. And it's going into location 100 USA. And it's for department 100. And it's for residential. None of this is what's determining the routing, right? Remember, I said it's department approval, and it's the department of the user putting it in. So it's going to be this Joe Gupser, that external user department, and then the manager of that department, which is the Joe controller one. And let's just say the rent's $12,000 here. And we're going to go ahead and submit that. And right here it is submitted. Okay, it's not pending, waiting to get converted to a new transaction. Notice I can't convert this one to a purchase order yet because it's waiting to be approved. So let's go out here and look at the view, look at the history. I can look at the approval history and it'll show me what it's waiting on. So it is department approval and it's sitting on department 100 because that's the external Joe Gupser's department. And the department manager is that Joe controller. So it's right now waiting for them, and it's been submitted to them. All right. Joe controller would have got an email like we saw in the other one saying, hey, you have this purchase requisition out there waiting for you to approve. Gives you the information about the vendor, the amount, and all that. Can click on display list of transactions to approve. We're already logged in on our screen as that Joe controller, but notice how I'm now in a different user where I submitted it as the Joe Gupser user up here in the top right. I am now in the approval process as Joe controller. So just like on the PO or the AP bills, I can come out here and look at it, see how everything looks, make sure it all looks good, look at the history of it, make sure it all looks good. Okay, I can go ahead and share that. I can come out here and let that post. Okay, I can come out here and approve it, and I can say approved, and I'm going to go ahead and approve it. So the Joe controller user has now approved it. Let's get out of Joe controller. We're back to the Joe Gupser user. Let's say we're done here. And notice how this now went from being submitted to now pending. And I now have the ability to come out here and say, okay, let's convert this to a purchase order and move on to the next phase of the process because it now has been approved, where before I could not do that. Okay. So that's a quick example of, so what we've covered so far is we went through all the transactions and discussed which ones can have approvals turned on for them. We looked at all the different approval types you could set up out there. We looked at a transaction department routing specific examples through AP bills and watched that process flow all the way through with the emails and the approval screens and all that kind of stuff. And we went through and did the same thing on the PO side with a different type of approval rule where it defaulted to the manager of the user putting it in of their department. So just wanted to kind of show you the different transactions out there, show you the way different approval rules would flow through, just to kind of give you a feel for how transactions work out there. I do want to show one thing. I did mention, notice how there's an attachment right here. Let me act like I'm putting in another AP here. And I'm going to go to AP. I'm going to go to not approve bills. I'm going to go to put a bill in. Okay, I'm going to add one here. Pick ABC here again. All right, I'm going to come down and I'm going to put this in as $1,002. And I'm going to pick this location, apartment. I'm not really concerned about what I'm putting here because I want to show you one more thing. Okay, notice this attachment right here. Let me, on my other screen over here, grab something. And I'm going to show you an example of how you can drag and drop attachments on your transaction. So let's say that you had a copy of the bill. All right, so I'm going to go out here. Let me get into it here, there. So here's the example of a bill. Let's say I'm going to grab it. See, I'm just dragging and dropping this document, holding my mouse button down, and I'm going to drop it right there in the attachments. And notice how it put that attachment out there. Okay, I can view it by clicking on that the paper clip there. I'm going to go ahead and submit this. Okay, and what I want to show you real quick, and this will be the last thing, we'll kind of circle back here a minute. Let this email come in for bill approver, or no, this is John approver because I picked department 100. So John approver has to log in. We haven't logged in as him yet. That's why it's asking us to log in here. But John approver, when he gets in here, if I go, and here's the one I just put in, this $1,002. Let me go out here and view this. He can see the attachment as well. And if his rights were set accordingly, which this one's not, he could drill down on that. But the way this one's set up, it's not set to allow that, but I could drill down on it and look at the bill out there as well if it was set accordingly. But I want to go ahead and approve this real quick. Let that approve. Okay. And then I'm done with John approver. But on down the line, that attachment that we just looked at here will stay with that transaction all the way through. Okay, it can always be drilled down on if the user has the appropriate rights to be able to drill down on it. It'll always be out there for them to look at. Okay. And that's really nice for when you're looking at transactions in the system and you're drilling down on dashboards and saying, okay, what made up that transaction? I click on it. I could drill all the way down to the document here. And then from this document, I could click on the attachment, all right there in the system, all attached, all combined as part of that. Okay. So that is basically what I wanted to cover. Let me start this PowerPoint here again real quick. So that's what I wanted to cover for the Sage Intacct approval processes out there. Just wanted to give you guys a feel for that, how it looked, how it worked through, what functionality is available out there. We have a Sage Intacct webinar series that we kind of have going on right now. The one we did today was the second in that series. We did last month. We did one on Sage Intacct Dimensions, dashboards, and reporting. So if you weren't able to attend that and you would like to watch that, we could send you the link to it. Just send us a note, and let us know. But the next two upcoming webinars that we currently have scheduled, on December 19th, we have one for Sage Intacct AP automation and bank feeds that we're going to be covering. And then on January 16th is the second one we kind of have out there scheduled for the future. And that's going to be covering Sage Intacct multi-entity environments. And that's going to be talking about how you have a top level that sits above all your companies in Sage Intacct if you take advantage of that. And at that top level, you can maintain things like your chart of accounts, your vendors, your customers. So you only have to have one list that you're maintaining across all your companies. So it helps, streamline and not have to enter it multiple times, all that good stuff. And that's where all the multi-entity intercompany stuff comes into play. So that's our next two webinars coming up. Look for emails coming from us as part of that. They'll go out like the ones have for the last two. So you'll be able to, sign up right from there. You can also go out to our webpage and go to our events out there, and you'll see them already on the calendar out there. So you could go ahead and already get signed up if you wanted to. And that's basically the end. So thanks again for attending. There again is my email address, Brett's email address, and our generic Cincinnati at Martin & Associates email address. If again anybody wants to email to request additional information, if they want to talk about anything further, reach out, let us know. We'll be happy to talk to you. I guess what I'd like to do now is kind of pause here. Betsy from my office is also on the call, and she's running the webinar here for us. I wanted to stop and see if we had any questions out there. If anybody has any questions, drop them into the question thing, and we'll get them answered here, but see if we have any out there right now.
We do. We have two. The first one is, do all transactions have to be approved, or can you set up a dollar amount? I think you covered that, but
yeah, we
might have come in before that question.
Can. It depends on it depends on the transaction rule assigned to the transaction that we're talking about. But if I do scroll up here a little bit, here is an example right here. This is an example of a purchase order where the first level of approver didn't have to approve until starting at $5,000. So because this PO was less than the level one's lower amount, that transaction does not have to go through approval processes. It just immediately gets approved and moves right on to the next phase. Let's say that this was a purchase requisition. It would have moved right on to the next phase of being able to be converted to a purchase order without having to go through approvals because of the way that rule was set up. Okay.
Okay, and then the other one we got was, what type of user accounts can do the approvals?
Okay, that's a good question. We didn't really talk about it in this class today. We've talked about it in other webinars we've done, but Sage Intacct has different user types available in the system. There is what's called a business user, which is a full-blown user that can access anything in the system, limited by their appropriate security roles that are assigned to them. Okay, that's one type of user. They can approve. There are also, if you're using the inventory module, for instance, there are warehouse users that can be added that only can do warehouse transactions, so things in AP, not AP, things in SO, sales order processing, purchasing, and inventory control. If it's a PO transaction that's set up for approval, they can be a part of the approval process. And then dropping down to the next level of user available in the system is what's called an employee user. And they're a user that is more limited in the system, and they come in packs of 10, not individual like the other two, but they are intended for, they can not do data entry in the system. They can only do inquiry and reporting, dashboards, kind of looking at data. They can be a part of the approval process. They can also put in, the only thing they can do data entry on is they can put in like purchase requisitions and timesheets and expense reports. But other than that, they're not a data entry user. But if it's just simply somebody who just needs to be a part of the approval process, but not really do much else in Sage Intacct, that's where an employee user kind of comes into play. They're just a part of the approval process. So any of those types can do that. And just want to show you here real briefly, if I go out to my users to show you what all each of those kind of mean, let me go out to company, admin, users. Here's the user type right here. So see how bill approver that we've been using to do approvals, he's only an employee user. Okay, Joe Controller is a full-blown business user. We didn't use Jacob Warehouse, but Jacob Warehouse is a warehouse user like we talked about. He could be a part of the approval process for purchase requisitions and things of that nature. So that's the different types of users who can approve and what all they can kind of do in the system. So good question. Any other ones come in, Betsy, or anything?
I don't see any other ones. We can wait a second if anyone wants to ask another one. You can unmute yourself, or you can just type in to either the Q&A or the webinar chat, and we can.
If there's questions you have after the fact too, you can always email email one of these email addresses right here that we talked about, either me or Brett or the overall Cincinnati one that kind of Betsy clears for us right there. So you could email any of those and just let us know questions you might have. We'd be happy to kind of answer them. We'd be happy to talk to you about it further. We'd be happy to get together with you and kind of show you the system and show you how it kind of works through maybe some specific questions that you might have. So I guess if we don't have any other ones coming in, we're right, kind of getting right up to the time of the webinar ending here. So I just want to, again, thanks for taking the time to kind of attend this today. You will be getting an email coming from us. That'll be a link to the webinar. So if you wanted to watch it again later, if you wanted to send it to somebody else in your office because you wanted them to watch it, you can forward it on, but it'll be a link to the webinar that you can that you'll have emailed to you there. And when do those usually go up, Betsy?
Within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours. Okay. All right. Again, I guess thanks again for attending, and look forward to talking to you guys further. Hopefully we'll see you on the webinar next month on the AP automation and the bank feeds. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Bye.